All right, good evening, Dr. Smythe. My name is Matt Schaupp-Ryan. I'm going to be speaking today about my environmental policy and ethics memo, which is directed to the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and the current administrator is the Honorable Andrew R. Wheeler. So, good evening, Mr. Wheeler. I'm writing to you today, or speaking to you today, about environmental racism and hazardous site plans. And specifically, we're going to be discussing the ongoing battle between prejudice, profits, and political power. Now, I'd like to begin by talking about how environmental racism has plagued minority communities for generations. But more specifically, across the 20th century, publicity and media attention have shed a light on the truth about environmental racism, specifically talking about economically disadvantaged communities and the impacts that these hazardous waste facilities are having on these underprivileged communities. Speaking about earlier research from the 1970s, environmental hazards were disproportionately cited. So, what exactly does that mean? Well, first off, there wasn't really any attention being paid to environmental hazards that were affecting these minority communities. And secondly, no support was really being engaged or focused towards these specific areas. And so, why, you may ask? Why is environmental racism, one, exist, and two, why is it attacking these underprivileged communities? So, it's three main factors. The first one, pure discrimination by polluters and politicians in siting decisions. The second one, leading to differences in economic relief towards minority and underprivileged communities. And the third, there's a clear lack of engagement by these communities to oppose siting decisions. And so you see, as a result of these three main factors, there's only been an increase in the exposure to environmental hazards that these facilities are creating. And so, what policy change is expected? What outcome is expected today from this discussion? I really call this meeting to order, one, because I hope that strict policy enforcement can come out of these decisions. And strict policy enforcement, not necessarily from the highest levels of government, but more importantly from the EPA, from the administrator of the EPA. Policy has come out regarding these environmental hazards and these risks that these chemical facilities are creating, but no policy enforcement has come as a result. And so specifically, I'm talking to the administrator, the Honorable Andrew R. Wheeler. And there's two main components out of this policy enforcement idea that I strive to hopefully achieve. The first one is to sustain compliance. And this compliance means that these chemical companies that are at large with these siting decisions, that they're being compliant with the environmental regulations that are set in stone by the EPA. The second one is most important, which is achieving environmental protection for all communities, not just for minority communities, not just for underprivileged communities, but for all communities across the United States. Everyone must feel safe where they live, regardless of whether there's a chemical factory there or not. There must be regulations in place that are complied by these chemical companies, and protection and safety must be of the utmost importance. And so we move into the next discussion, which is truly understanding what environmental racism is. I'd like to refer to Reverend Benjamin Chavis, who defined environmental racism. He states that environmental racism is a disproportionate imposition of environmental hazards on minority communities, both intentionally and unintentionally. And so you see, the issue is that environmental racism presents a growing conflict between the rights and privilege of industry and that of the individual. And so we move into what exactly is a facility siting or a siting plan. And so siting by these chemical factories is one of the grounds where these chemical factories and facilities are being established. And so siting is broken up into four main topics: siting criteria, siting board, emphasis on public participation, and state approval/perception. And I'd like to focus on two of these main factors: emphasis on public participation and state approval and perception. So the first one, emphasis on public participation. Public participation has been non-existent with these chemical companies coming in and truly monopolizing the market, creating a dominance where these communities that these chemical factories are set up in don't have a voice, or their voice is silenced by these large fossil fuel companies. A second one is state approval and perception. And so the state truly neglects the rights of their citizens by allowing these large chemical companies to monopolize the market, to control the market, and one, putting power in the hands of politicians, and two, putting power in the hands of industry that ultimately neglects the rights of the citizen. And so we go into two clashing perspectives that I'd like to discuss. The first one are the benefits, the financial benefits, which industry truly brings to light, talking about investing in the financial future of these communities. But then there's the social counter where the citizens rise up and talk about the negative environmental impacts that these chemical factories and facilities are having on their on their communities. And so again, this creates a clash of perspective. So moving into policy, there have been policy developments throughout the 1970s and into the turn of the century, with two main policies I'd like to discuss. The first one is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, also known as the RCRA. And the second one is an executive order coming out of the Clinton administration, Executive Order 12898. Both of these policies talk about mitigating environmental hazards and environmental risks in these minority communities. However, they don't truly enforce the policy, which again is the issue here. Sustaining compliance and providing protection and safety for these communities. And so what exactly is the policy change? Going back to that policy change that we talked about earlier. The first one is, again, the safety. So how exactly are we going to enforce environmental standards and enforce compliance by improving the safety of these communities as well? And so I talk about two specific actors and stakeholders. The first one is the EPA. Again, as the administrator, Mr. Wheeler, enforcement must come from the highest levels of the EPA. And that's important because, one, it sets a standardized structure, a structure where enforcement can consistently come from, and a structure where these chemical companies know why they need to comply with these environmental regulations and what the repercussions will be if they do not. The second one is NEPA, and NEPA provides more of a blanket of oversight where environmental enforcement can come from, but then also where the regulatory oversight can take place from. And so from this, there's two specific examples where enforcement can be exemplified from, and that these are environmental impact statements, also known as EISs, and environmental assessments. And these two specific examples are methods that can be used by the states and also through federal oversight to ensure that compliance is maintained by these chemical companies. So again, Mr. Wheeler, I speak to you today not to say that policy doesn't matter, but to say that policy without enforcement is detrimental to these communities, these minority communities where environmental hazards do exist. And if change does not occur, environmental prejudice and environmental racism will only continue to plague these communities. Thank you very much, and have a great evening.